it was the mid to late 90s, and I traded a job on Wall Street, actually, in Latin American corporate finance, surprise, surprise. And I had a business journalism, business research fellowship, really, that took my wife and me on a 2-year journey across rural Mexico. So we're bumping around in the back roads in our truck and meeting lots of folks who lacked the very basics, clean water, electricity, and medicine, and basic education, basic nutrition. And I became really fascinated by agriculture and production of food and traditional farming practices in rural Mexico. And so while I was in southern Mexico, I worked with an association of vanilla farmers, so toiling away to improve the lives of dozens of indigenous families. And they were grappling, Lori, with drug traffickers that were operating under the cover of the jungle around them. And what surprised me was that vanilla cooperative failed ultimately, not because of its volatile surroundings, but because they couldn't access the capital they needed to get to market and to succeed. And so I started, 2020 hindsight, but I started thinking about how one might change that outcome. And it was out of that experience, really. The 2 years in Mexico, but especially working with that vanilla cooperative, that Root Capital kind of sprung. And now, as for what was happening in the world at large at that time that made me think Root Capital was needed, first off, I would say that microfinance, right? So the $300 loan to the fruit vendor and the artisan weaver, the shoe cobbler, was a big focus in the late 1990s when it came to financial inclusion in low and middle income countries, whether it be urban or rural. And it turns out my wife, my better half, Virginia, who had also worked on Wall Street, spent a lot of time in Mexico as a consultant to Acción International, which is a very important microfinance player. And so I was very familiar with micro lending and Women's World Banking and Grameen and so on. And yet I observed that there was very little attention at the time that was being paid to what, as you said, Laurie, what we now call the missing middle. So like the small and medium enterprises, SMEs, like a farmer cooperative, that are too big for microfinance, yet too small, too risky, too remote for the bank. So I kind of set my sights there in those early days, how to fill that missing middle. And I've pretty much been focused on that ever since. I can't believe it's been more than 20 years. But I'd say more importantly, Laurie, in terms of like finding my calling, if you will, and kind of the work of a lifetime, as a white man of relative privilege, raised in a very wealthy country, living in rural Mexico really opened my eyes to a reality that really far too people appreciate or even know about. And that poverty today at the global level is concentrated then and today in a single profession, which is farming. So there are 500 million small-scale farmers in the world. And as you said earlier, 2.5 billion people, family and household members who depend on those farmers for their livelihoods and their well-being. So food security, access to healthcare, opportunities for education, yet most are living on a few dollars a day. So they lack the basics, which is why the World Bank estimates that growth in the agricultural sector versus growth in any other sector is up to 2 to 4 times more effective at raising incomes in resource poor countries. So, boom, that's where I chose to focus my career at that time, and really all my time and effort since then. Now, you mentioned partners just really quickly, what partners we needed really early on to make it a reality. I'd highlight two to oversimplify, because there are a lot of partners, even early on. But when we came back from Mexico for my wife to go to business school in Boston, I befriended pretty quickly a local impact investor, a very early mover impact investor and donor who'd been an organic farmer. He'd studied in the seminary. He'd launched a compost company, an organic compost company in New England. And he might have come from the Berkshires, he didn't, but, and he agreed to help cover my early expenses. And he put up the initial capital for those few pilot loans early on. So that's one partner. The second one, which I want to highlight, because it was really important early on, we identified a buyer based in Brattleboro, Vermont, called Forest Trade. And it was founded by an amazing guy named Tomas Fricka, who's a nature-based entrepreneur who'd worked at the World Wildlife Fund in Southeast Asia. And he'd been very involved in Ben and Jerry's early efforts to source things like Brazil nuts directly from indigenous communities in the Amazon. And so we made our very first loan ever in 1999 to a cooperative in northwestern Guatemala called Asobagri, which was a supplier of that company, Forest Trade. And so we fronted the cash to the co-op at harvest time so the farmers could get paid well and on time. And when they delivered their crop to the cooperative, right? And then once the coffee was later shipped, many months later, to Forest Trade actually paid us back for what the cooperative had been advanced, owed us, and then plus interest. And the rest of the rest was paid back to the cooperative. So basically, we were off to the races. That triangulated kind of loan payment was present in the very first loan that we made.